Um, Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'm Laurie Achtman with the Penn Center for Innovation, and I'm pleased to be here with the launch again of our commercialization speaker series. I'm really pleased that we have Rick Jones with us from BioAdvance, who BioAdvance has been a consistent supporter of PCI in various ways. They're a regional life science investor, and Rick is a partner and has a lot of experience in the industry. BioAdvance has invested in several Penn companies, and I know Rick is on the board of a really neat medical device company that we developed with a faculty member called Bright Air. And that's Jake Brenner. And I also just wanted to highlight, my colleague Sam can put in the chat, we have a number of programs coming up that could be of interest around commercialization topics. And right now we're virtual, but we hope to go back to fully in person by October, but we'll see. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Rick. Feel free to introduce yourself. And we're excited to hear about what you're seeing in terms of trends in investing and what you're looking out for, and maybe what we should all be looking out for. I'll also add, I'm happy to moderate questions, you know, at the appropriate time, either during or at the end. And thanks to everyone for joining us.
Great. Thanks a lot, Laurie. It's a real pleasure to be here. I appreciate your including BioAdvance in this series, and I'm happy to be here representing them, and basically to talk a little bit about a primer on where venture capital stands in biotech, and a few hopefully helpful hints about how you can approach the VC markets these days. So let me see if I can share my screen. Okay. Now, can you all see that? I'm going to go into... Can everybody see that slide? Okay.
Yep.
Just a little bit about me. I have a long history at Penn. I'm actually third generation, and my kids are fourth generation Penn, so very committed to the university in general. But you can see the range of training I've had there. I went to the med school and then ended up doing the Wharton Executive Program a few years after that. I did practice internal medicine for a number of years before going into industry. And in industry, I followed a path that took me from big pharma through biotech roles in medical affairs and business development, and eventually in biotech as a CEO at Anchor. And then for the last number of years, I've been on the investment side of things with Broadview Ventures in Boston, and for the last almost 5 years now, BioAdvance in Philadelphia. I also like to mention at this point that I've been a patient along the way, and I think that all of us in sort of developing our careers in this area, we need to always keep sight of, it's not just the company, it's not just the technology, but it's the people that are eventually going to be helped by that technology. So a little bit about BioAdvance, first of all, then I'll talk about the current VC landscape. There's been a lot of sort of both news, but also a lot of rumor and innuendo concern about what's going to happen to the VC funding of biotech going forward. I'll talk a little bit about the regional landscape here in Philadelphia and how we stack up in terms of getting funding. And then finish up by spending some time talking about how you might raise your odds if you're interested in sometime either sooner or later going after VC funding, how you might improve your odds of doing that. So first of all, just taking a guess that some people might not be really well versed in what venture capital is, I think it's useful to go through sort of what the structure is mainly so you recognize that venture capital, like any business, has an ultimate bottom line, and we can't lose sight of that going forward. So venture capital is basically private money, in other words, not on the public stock markets, looking to take high risks, invest in high risks for the possibility of getting high returns. Usually, people who have a lot of private money to invest end up allocating some small percentage, maybe 5%, maybe 10%, to something like venture capital, and with the hopes that that part of their portfolio might make their overall portfolio give it a little boost in terms of its returns. Because it is taking high risk, the goal is to beat the average market return. In other words, why invest in VC if you can just invest in treasury bonds or an index fund on the stock market? So we're always looking to beat those returns. The money that goes into VC largely is raised in discrete pools, or what are called funds. And these funds that are invested by professionals who are entrusted with that money by the limited partners who are investing the money. And the model is those professionals will invest that pool of money over the first few years. Usually these funds have a 10-year lifespan over which they can operate. So you try and get the money out the door into these attractive investments the first few years, and then spend the last part of the fund's life harvesting those returns on those investments, where you're selling your position in the company, and then you distribute those returns back to your investors. At the same time, while you're doing that harvesting, you're looking forward to that next fund of money, so you're out raising that. So how do venture capitalists make money? Well, there is an annual fee, usually around 2%, paid by their investors to them to manage this pool of money. But the biggest part of the returns is that even though they're not investing a lot of personal money, although there is some personal money in almost all these venture capital groups, they are harvesting a significant amount of the capital gain on the investments that they're making. And that's typically around 20%. So even though they might be contributing 1% to the fund, they're getting 20% of the capital gain that happens when they sell their stake in these companies. So that 2 and 20, 2% fee, 20% return is kind of the standard way for venture capitalists to make their money. Now, how is BioAdvance different? Well, a number of significant ways. First of all, we're an evergreen fund. That is, we don't raise new money along the way. We in fact don't have limited partners at all, and I'll get to why that is in a moment. So we're continuously recycling the funds that we make from our investments, and trying to grow our funds so that we can write bigger checks down the road and so on. We're also regionally focused, particularly on the Philadelphia region, which is not just Philadelphia, but includes all the counties around it, extending, we consider sort of Princeton down to Wilmington. That being said, we will invest as far away as Greater New York, or as far away as Greater Washington, D.C. Probably the most important is that we are mission driven. We're actually a nonprofit organization. We got our start being set up to manage a Pennsylvania state program back in 2002 that allocated money from the tobacco settlement, and originally was meant to invest in the local Philadelphia ecosystem. That contract ran out in around 2012, 2013, and we continue to recycle those funds, as I mentioned above. We are still very much interested in the Philadelphia region. We have broadened our geography a little bit, as I've already mentioned. But the other thing is that we continue to have this nonprofit mission to try and help companies as much as we can, help the ecosystem. We'll even make investments in non-financial return kinds of opportunities, like we brought the Big 4 Bio newsletter to the area, and we've invested in other non-company kind of assets to improve the local ecosystem. That being said, we need to make money to stay in business. So we always keep that in mind, and you should keep that in mind when you're coming to BioAdvance. We don't make grants. We are looking for businesses that in the long run can return to financial returns to us. So since our inception, we've invested over 60 million into 100 companies. There are about 159 products or services, and the main thing is that that 61 million has led to 3.84 billion in other money coming into the companies that we've invested in. It's not always directly because of BioAdvance, but usually our investment plays a key role then in attracting other investment partners. So a couple of recent investments we've made. Interface is a really interesting Penn spin-out that is developing these elongated neurons in culture, which can basically reconstruct neural tracts in the brain. And they're using their first kinds of cell cultures to reconstruct the Niagara striatal tract that's lost in Parkinson's disease. So it's a completely new way of conceiving cell therapy, which involves 3D structures as opposed to just little cells sitting in one place. We also just invested in Senzo, which is a handheld point of care diagnostic device. It looks like a little like your standard COVID test or pregnancy test, but it has the sensitivity and selectivity of PCR. So it has the promise of completely revolutionizing point of care disposable tests for COVID and other infectious diseases. And then finally, we recently invested in another cell company called Serpont, which modifies macrophages in culture so that they express low levels of SERP-A, which is a key immunomodulatory compound on their surface. And they've shown remarkable efficacy in animal models of cancer. They should be getting into human trials in early 2023. So we do invest in anything in human life sciences, therapeutics, anything from small molecules to cell and gene therapy, a few medical devices, actually do a lot of digital health as well.
Let me take a look. Hang on one second.
Is there a question?
If everyone could mute while our speaker is talking, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. So let's talk about where VC is these days in the big picture. As always, there are some hot areas and some not so hot areas. These actually haven't changed a whole lot in the last few years, although I would say, as we'll get to, there's been increased interest in much more efficient business plans. So, you know, cell and gene therapies remain very hot. People are particularly interested in allogeneic therapies, so you can have cell therapies that sit on the shelf made from immortalized cell lines that anybody can tolerate, as opposed to having to harvest cells and modify them, re-inject them into patients, which can be very time consuming and inefficient from a scaling point of view. Also, we see a lot of projects that are basically attempting to modify cell phenotypes by culture conditions and so on, as opposed to modifying them with genetic engineering to turn them into CAR-Ts and so on. I would say that those culture type conditioning, even though we've invested in a company like that, are definitely less sort of attractive right now than those cells which are otherwise modified by mRNA or CRISPR or gene editing, et cetera. I would say that currently in vivo gene editing, sort of giving people CRISPR-based therapies is kind of in a holding pattern while we wait to see what some of the early companies do and how they succeed with their things which are just reaching the clinic right now. There's a lot of gene editing therapy platforms above and beyond CRISPR that are kind of waiting in the wings to see if they can make a claim that they're improving, but people are taking a cautious kind of approach to that. I think one thing that's pretty hot right now is nobody's satisfied with what's available currently as the vectors. I mean, Jim Wilson has done a lot of work on trying to come up with new vectors that are more tissue specific, that can carry larger payloads, et cetera. They might be viral based, they might be non-viral based. but there's a lot of interest in vector alternatives to sort of make gene editing therapies practical. Oncology remains really hot, although there's huge competition now for getting into clinical trials. So unless you're really well funded and could go to clinical sites and promise them, extraordinary payments for recruiting patients and so on, you might find yourself with really interesting biology, but just no access to patients. Inflammation, autoimmune disease, immunology, non-Alzheimer's, neurodegenerative disease, Parkinson's, Huntington's, and so on remain hot. And then finally, there's still some significant interest in new technology platforms. So sort of the capstan-like combinations of technologies that promise to be able to generate new drugs, new therapies in completely novel ways are still attractive, as evidenced by Capstan's recent huge Series A financing. Not hot right now and not for a long time have been things like antibiotics. Even though there's a tremendous need for antibiotics, it's just a very, very difficult market and exit situation for VCs. Wound healing, things like stroke healing, those are really, really tough conditions. And you got to realize if you're in one of these areas, it's not that there's not a medical need. It's that there's been so many failures that people just feel like it's a black hole. And you've got to have extraordinary levels of evidence to get people interested when they can go and choose the next oncology project instead, or the next project in an autoimmune disease. So something to keep in mind. And then finally, if you're interested in developing a device or diagnostic, the key there is that there's just a limited investor base, many fewer funds in those areas than there are in therapeutics, for instance. And that just limits the potential for raising money in those areas. And there's some macroeconomic reasons for that, which we can get into, but just keep that in mind. So the other thing to keep in mind is let's talk about current market conditions. So this is sort of what's happened in the last 6 months to a year. And just remember, VCs have to make money, and they typically make money when they sell their ownership. That might be to a strategic who's acquiring the company. But there's only a limited amount of appetite for that amongst strategics. For a long time, we've had this great opportunity to get public investors to buy the companies during IPOs, but that's not been possible for about the last year or so. Basically, when the stock markets were under pressure, people decided they were even less interested in riskier stocks, so they started running away from biotech IPOs, which are about the riskiest thing you can get into. The companies aren't making money. In fact, they're losing money hand over fist as they do their R&D. So they ran away from those, so VCs couldn't get exits by selling those early stage companies on the market. They had to put more money into their existing portfolio while they waited for that market to open up, or while they could sell it to a strategic. So there's been this increased focus on these business plans, which are more efficient. In the past few years, companies could raise a lot of money, spend a lot of time to build a huge team, build a huge laboratory, do a lot of work on building their platform across multiple pipeline projects. There's, with this sort of limited focus on limited capital, companies now are much more focused on, let's take one asset, move it ahead as quickly as we can, as efficiently as we can. And so you'll see a lot of places, pipelines are being, people are walking away from their pipeline, at least for the time being, and spending money on their lead asset. New investments, when they're occurring, are generally occurring also at a later stage, because companies want, or investors want, something that's as close as possible to an exit. And so they're really scrutinizing a business plan for its efficiency in moving things forward as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And this demands teams that are really as experienced as possible in order to implement a plan like that. So it's more important than ever to build the right team around your project. So what are some of the regional trends? Well, this is the overall trend in the US towards raising VC money, and you can, and this, the last figure, 2022, is those numbers were pulled on September 7th. They probably represent data that's complete through mid to late July, because it can be delayed in getting into the PitchBook database. So you can see that actually, even though people have been worried about VC funding going forward, there's actually still, if we sort of double that figure or roughly double it, it's still going to be a great year for VC in the US. And the same holds in Philadelphia. If you, again, double that number in 2022, we're going to end up in one of the top 2 or 3 years in VC in the area. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that, and I think that the Capstan Series A that's just been announced is a great example of this. Obviously, BioAdvance with our size is not going to be able to significantly participate in a Series A that's over $100 million. So you need, and BioAdvance is one of the 2 largest biotech early stage investors in the Philadelphia region. So if you want to raise significant dollars, you have to rely on outside capital in our area. And we are attractive to outside capital. We're second or third on the list of places that investors in the Bay Area and New York and even Boston look to when they're looking to invest in biotech. And so finally, actual Series A investments in the area. Again, if you look at the 2022 numbers and you extrapolate to what they should look like by the end of the year, because if anything, investment trends are picking up, I would say, as the sort of market trends become a little bit clearer in people's minds. We should end up still with one of the better years in Series A financing in the local area. So the bottom line is there has been a huge amount of money raised over the last 3 or 4 years to go into these funds. These funds only make money if they deploy those funds that they've raised. They don't like to return capital to their limited partners if they can avoid it. They have been getting a 2% fee, but what they want is that 20% on the returns that they make. So there's a huge amount of money that's been raised. There's still a huge amount of money yet to be deployed. You could see that in the numbers that despite all the market factors, there's still a significant amount of money going into these areas. And the thing to keep in mind is you're just going to have to go outside of the Philadelphia region to find those large pools.
Rick, can I interrupt for one? I have not seen a slide like that before that showed the amount of outside capital by city.
Yeah.
And maybe it's just because I haven't been in the right places to see that. But that's really interesting. Is that something that you all are putting out there or calculated? Or I'm just curious because I think that's a really important point and a good way to illustrate it.
Yeah, so this number, I'm sorry, I should have credited this, but it came out of the PACT Venture Capital Report for 2021, which is why the last numbers there for 2021. So PACT is the Philadelphia Alliance for Capital and Technology. They are the kind of regional industry collaborative, if you will, for private equity, private money investors. So it includes everything from angel groups to private equity groups. And they have a conference every year. It's actually coming up in November that I'll mention later on, where local companies can pitch locally as opposed to having to go on the road. But they put together a venture capital report every year in the Philadelphia region. So that's where this comes from.
Okay, that's great, and thank you. And I agree, PACT is a great place to get engaged, but I'll let you talk about that more later. Please proceed.
Okay, so here are the local investors that you should keep an eye on. There's a number of pretty active angel groups. There are some early stage investors in the area. Medical Excellence Capital is a new fund that just closed on, I think, $145 million and looks to be interested in new company formation, so they're looking at early stage. Osage is a local group. Obviously, they participate in early stage. IP Group is very active at Penn. They do a lot of company formation. Hatch, the Hatch Fund is something that was started by the Biotech Center in Doylestown. It's since been sort of taken over by Brandywine, which invested in the fund as well. It's not clear if Brandywine will only invest in companies that are in Brandywine's a real estate developer, builds a lot of labs and office space for biotech, in addition to all kinds of other real estate. So whether they're going to invest in anything outside of their real estate portfolio, I'm not sure of, but that's another $25 million. BioAdvance, of course. Ben Franklin Technology, very, very busy investors, especially in med tech and digital health, a little bit in therapeutics. And then finally, obviously there are a number of institutions, including Penn, that have internal funds that will invest in targeted areas of technology coming out of their institutions. There are a few late stage funds. 1315 is a device fund and health services fund looking mainly at revenue, companies that are already profitable, making revenue. New Rhine is a fund that invests in companies that are repurposing drugs, so-called 505(b)(2) pathways. And then New Spring is a local private equity group, again, that's usually investing in revenue generating companies down the road. So just a little bit of practical advice about fundraising. This is a key point that I always try and make, and that is we have a lot of pride in Philadelphia. I have a lot of pride in Philadelphia. Philadelphia has a huge amount of innovation coming out of here. But this is a global industry. Your technology is going to compete globally, and it needs to be supported globally, both by sort of the science that you're bringing in, as well as by the capital that you're bringing in. So when you evaluate the problem and the opportunity, you've got to consider the global environment, what your competition is, not just in Philly, and what your competition is, not just against your particular target or your particular mechanism, but in general, what the competition is in the area, around the world, and around that particular indication. And you definitely need to go beyond local sources of capital, as I've mentioned a couple times. You need to structure your business plan about how you're going to reach this increased value for your business. And you need to raise enough money to get to that increased value, because if you only get to the middle of the bridge, so to speak, and you haven't gotten to your destination, nobody's going to come in and invest in a company that's in the middle of nowhere. So you've got to be able to say, I've accomplished all this, and the company's more valuable now than it was when the first money went in. I think you've got to pursue all sources. A lot of people don't want to go after SBIRs because of the timeline and so on. But for a lot of the institutes, there's a 10% plus approval rate for SBIRs, and you're not going to find any VC that approves 10% of their deals. We invest in about 1% of what we see, and that's probably average for most VCs. You can be a lot more efficient by filtering your VCs and your non-VC sources by what their focus is. I've said again and again, we're a mid-Atlantic focused fund, and yet we get tons of people who are trying to pitch us who are from outside of our region. It's just a complete waste of their time. And then finally, it's always good to have warm introductions. Obviously, you can cold call any number of these companies, but getting somebody to introduce you to them is really, really important. The only way you can do that is to get out there and meet as many people as possible and look for that opportunity for them to refer you within their network. So how can you find potential VCs out there if you've never done this before? I think a great place to start is to look at similar companies in your space and look on their website, see who's on their board, see what their news release says about who was in their Series A and so on, and add those venture capitalists to your list because they're obviously interested in the area. I think it's also important to get out to these investor conferences, and I've listed a few here. Bio, JP Morgan, Resi, they're all nationally sort of focused, packed in the middle of the regional line there. That's a regional one here in Philadelphia. And then there are specific conferences as well for med tech devices and digital health. So pick the conferences that have the most impact in your area and make sure you get to them. I know you don't have a big budget, but go and stay with a friend, couch surf, Airbnb, whatever it is, but somehow figure out a way to get to these places and get in front of the right people. And you'll learn just by seeing how other companies are pitching and so on, how you should modify your pitch. There are also free newsletters, lots of them that you can subscribe to. Big Four Bio, I think, is really important because it's Philly centric, and it's you can get a good idea of what's happening in the area, but they also have newsletters for Boston, San Francisco, and San Diego. PitchBook, you can sign up for their newsletter and get interesting information about new funding every day. Now that covers every industry, not just biotech. And it's the same with National Venture Capital Association newsletter. But you'll see some biotech news in there. And then finally, Fierce Bio newsletters are great places to get sort of national and international news about our industry. Endpoints news is another that you could add to that list. So, keep in touch with the industry, see who's getting funded, and that'll give you a great idea of what you need to do to get yourself recognized. So when you do approach the funds, it's important that you recognize that not every investor has a similar investment strategy. Obviously, angel investors are mainly individuals, sometimes investing as groups, have completely different interests than early stage VCs do. And early stage VCs have completely different interests than later stage or crossover type funds do. So save your time by focusing on the right audience. Look for funds that have raised their money recently, because as I mentioned, they try and invest that over the first 3 or 4 years. If there's a fund that did its close 6 or 7 years ago, they're just not going to have money to invest in new companies at that point, and that's going to be a low yield kind of outreach. Make sure that your stage and target, again, fit the company fund sweet spot. If you're a medical device company and there's probably not much use in approaching funds that only invest in therapeutics and vice versa. See if you can generate at least one internal champion. All funds, including BioAdvance, operate as partnerships. No decision is made without a partnership discussion, and you need to find at least one partner who's going to be your cheerleader in that fund, and then work closely with them and address whatever questions they have. Make sure that your raise fits the standard check size. Now, BioAdvance's check size for a therapeutic is up to $1.5 million. There are a lot of funds that can invest in increments of smaller than 5 or 10 million. If you've raised 250 or 300 million and you've got to deploy that over 2 or 3 years, you can't write checks of 500,000 or $1 million. There's just too many. You'd have to make too many investments, and you couldn't do the diligence on all of them. So you're looking to write much bigger checks. And then make sure your valuation, that is, how what the value that you're going to offer to the investor is in some reasonable range, or at least that you're open-minded and willing to discuss it. At the end of the day, you're only worth as much as the market will pay. You're not worth as much as you think you are, or you're not worth as much as you've gotten in research funding. You're not even worth as much as you've gotten in previous venture funding if you haven't made any progress at all and the market has changed under your feet. So you've got to be open-minded. Obviously, if you can get more than one investor to get into some kind of an auction, you might get better valuation that way. But don't just arbitrarily have something that might be non-market in mind. Remember, it's a two-way street. So in your pitch, remember that you've got to show you solve this important problem, investors can make money, and you have the right team. The problem's got to be big enough so that people actually will put significant money towards it. And that doesn't mean if you're a cell biologist and you are having trouble with the different pipettes that you're using, coming up with a different pipette design. There are a lot of cell biologists out there. It's a huge problem for you, but in the scheme of things, that's not a big business when it comes to making money for investors and so on. So make sure that your problem is big enough that it's going to require significant resources to attract these kind of investors. You've got to have some kind of data. It can't just be an idea on an envelope. You've got to be able to show that you actually do something, or else you're still in the research phase and you should be living off of grants and so on. And then finally, again, remember that your competition is global, and you've got to first of all, be aware of that competition, show that you're aware, and show how you have some kind of advantage over that competition. Make sure there are buyers for your solution. See that strategic buyers are interested in the space, or that public investors have shown that they're willing to invest in it. Make sure that you can get to the point where buyers would be interested within a reasonable time frame. And then make sure that considering the amount of money that'll be invested, that you're going to have a big enough increase in value that it's going to justify the venture capital kind of investment because of the returns that they're seeking. And then finally, build a team around you. There's no one that knows it all. You've got to surround yourself by people who know what they're doing. You've got to be aware of what you don't know and fill those holes. That team can be, full-time if you can afford it, but it can also be part-timers or consultants. But you've got to demonstrate to your investors that you've assembled the right skill set around. You should not try to do it by yourself. It's very unlikely, particularly if you're a first-timer, that you'll be able to pull this off. It's just too complicated and too full of major issues that need to be addressed. I strongly advise against hiring your family. Every year we get 2 or 3 proposals where a father's hired his son or daughter to try and get the company commercialized. It rarely works. It's just too hard for there to be, sort of objective sort of feedback and assessment of the technology. And then finally, this is particularly important in academic audience. You might be the best academic, amongst those very successful academics and supporting a lab and running a team of people. That doesn't mean that you're ready to run a biotech company. There are a few who've done it, but it's a very difficult job. And at least the first time around, you should be looking for help. And then finally, I'll just remind you that investors are part of your team too. We're not the enemy. We're there to help. Our goal should be the same as yours, to make this a success and move it ahead. So remember, BioAdvance, again, we provide advice like this as well as capital. We'll do everything you can if you send us your pitch to provide something that's useful in return, even if it's not money. You can always send your pitch decks into Marnie McCoy, who handles all of our information flow, or contact me at BioAdvance if you just have a general question to ask, and I'd be happy to try and answer that as well as I can. I am going to be doing an open office hours at Penn coming up soon, and if you want to jump into that, be happy to meet you there as well. So with that, I want to thank Laurie again for including me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thanks, Rick. Do folks have questions? Feel free to unmute and ask, or you can throw something in the chat. And maybe while you're thinking of any questions, I'll ask a question and say, at what point, you kind of laid this out, but when should folks start talking to you to make it the best way to build the relationship? And I know you all are very generous with your time and advice, but if you could just kind of maybe lay out a somewhat ideal scenario, or one that typically or just works well from your perspective.
Yeah, so I'll draw sort of 2 thresholds there. One is for general advice, and one is when we might get interested in investing in something. And for the investing, I'll talk mainly about therapeutics, but if you have an interest in devices or digital health, we can also talk about that. For therapeutics, we like there to be an identified molecule which meets the criteria, at least as a lead candidate, that has some in vivo efficacy and proof of our target validity, and there's a path towards getting it through pre-IND development and into the clinic. So there needs to be at least a molecule. We don't like to pay for medicinal chemistry campaigns that are basically looking for hits and then trying to do med chem around those hits. That would be too early for us. Obviously, that's, when you have a antibody, oftentimes there's less optimizing to do. When you have to create if you've created a CAR T cell, sometimes there's very little optimizing to do. So, but once you have what seems to be a product, that would be when we could consider it. In terms of advice, we prefer to talk to people earlier rather than later, even if it's you and we clearly understand it's not ready for BioAdvance funding. We can help with things like sort of deciding how you should develop, sort of what are the key steps in developing, what are the key de-risking steps that would be important to investors, what are sort of the more attractive therapeutic areas that you might think about, more efficient ways to get to value. So I don't mind talking to people at a very early stage. I'll leave it at that. It's conceivable that it might be even too early for me to have any comments on, but we'll try and do our best to add value even at early stages.
Okay, thank you so much. It looks like we have another question in the chat. What investment analysis do you perform for small molecules versus biological?
So a big thing with the for both of them, there's going to be IP diligence. And for biologicals, that's relatively straightforward. You're basically looking for binding sequences. For small molecules, it could be a little bit more complicated because you have to go through, you have to have a specialist who's really familiar with Markov structures and making sure that you thoroughly evaluate the literature for any compounds that might overlap with your compounds in one way or the other. There's also more concern about things like PK. Are you reaching therapeutic concentrations with your dosage, how you're going to dose the small molecule, what's the availability, that sort of thing. Those things are generally pretty straightforward with biologics. So yeah, it's a different exercise, but it's one that we've been through many times before, and we feel like we can do it pretty efficiently. A bigger concern for most of the things we look at is actually target validity and how much can we believe the molecule, the sort of evidence for the efficacy data that we see, whether that be in vitro or in vivo. And so it's really important for any big pharma, and it's important for us because our team is dominated by people who grew up in big pharma, to really connect the dots carefully between sort of whatever effect you might see with, is the drug engaging with the target? Is that the mechanism by which it's having its activity? That's really important to our team.
Great, thank you. Do we have any other questions? I really liked your point about the importance of partnering with national investors. So I think that's a very positive way to spin that we might not have as deep wells of investor money right here in Philadelphia, but we have enough like you guys to we rely on you to help get these companies started and then those additional relationships. So
yeah.
Yeah,
very important. I mean, and the encouraging thing is, as I showed, we know that outside investors and Capstan's an excellent example of this. Very little of that money came from within Philadelphia. So outside investors will invest in local technology, but I've seen any number of teams who, spend all their time trying to get a few $100,000 out of local angels and they, for some reason, just don't want to travel. Well, I'm sorry, you've got to get out there, you've got to travel, you've got to knock on all those doors, whether that's at conferences or whether it's going to see people in their offices. People are willing to hear you out, but you've got to make yourself known.
Well, that's a great point. So thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for joining us. My colleague Sam put a link to all of our upcoming programs and events, and we'll have a lot more information soon about our plans for JPM and South by Southwest and Bio. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us. It was great to host you, and we'd love to circulate the slides to the attendees afterwards.
Okay,
So,
I'll send the deck to you, Laurie.
Okay, thanks again, Rick.
You're welcome. Thank
Thanks,
you, everyone. Take care.